Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the San Mateo-Foster City School District Board Study Session. Today is September 12th, and I'm calling the meeting to order at 5:33 p.m. We will start with a flag salute, so if everyone could please stand and join me with the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, we'll do roll call. I'll start with Trustee Trin.
Here.
Trustee Kim.
Here.
And I am also here. Trustee Brooks is not here tonight. We can move on to item 4, approval of the agenda.
Motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
Thank you, Trustee Trin, for the motion and Trustee Kim for the second. We will now go to item 5, which is public statements related to agenda items. Please limit statements to 3 minutes, and just in typical fashion, we will take public comment now, and then we'll check in again somewhere in the middle, and then maybe if we have some more time at the end, we can add some more public comment. But is there anyone in the room that has any public comment? One person? Okay. Can we check with Zoom to see if there's anyone that has public comment, please?
Yes, checking. No public comment at this time.
All right, then we can go to item 6, which is the equity-focused student achievement report and discussion.
All right, good evening. David Chambliss, Assistant Superintendent of Education Services, here this evening with 2 colleagues from our department. If you would introduce yourselves.
Good evening, Pam Barfield, Executive Director of Curriculum Instruction for our elementary schools.
Good evening, Kenyatta Cook, Executive Director of Curriculum Instruction for our middle schools.
And we're excited to share with you this evening, actually the second inaugural equity-focused student achievement board study session, picking up on the one that we held in September of last year. The second here, and I'm going to share slides with you. And we will begin presentation with the opportunity for lots of discussion this evening about the information enclosed. All right. Good. Okay. So the emphasis tonight is to spend time as a group talking about the key strategies that are embedded in our strategic plan, particularly focused on equity, and thinking about the impact of those actions as they are affecting and supporting student performance. So kind of the key thing kind of to frame the discussion tonight is that this isn't meant to be a discussion of all the actions or a discussion of all the data. In fact, we'll be back in a couple of weeks to do a deeper dive around last spring's CASC data. But tonight is meant to be rather targeted steps into particular actions and particular sets of data that we think say something about the impact of those actions. So we invite you, of course, as board at any point as we're going through to ask questions, and then our presentation is approximately 30-40 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity then for deeper board discussion. So the work that we're doing in the district, really now going into our 3rd year as guided by the strategic plan, is in every way to think about changing the conditions that have created our achievement gaps. One of our former board members often said that we get the results that the system is designed to produce. And if we're going to get more equitable results, then we have to change the system that is producing those results. So our strategic plan is the way in which we are going about that. So we are, as part of this work, obviously, it's important to find the best ways to support our students. We want to think about what we expect to work. And if we're finding that it's not working, then we would expect that we should adjust that. at the heart of this work, particularly the equity work, is that there's a lot of strategies in our strategic plan that are meant for all students. When we talk about implementing new curriculum for all students, for example, when we talk about PD for all of our teachers, that foundational PD. But then within that, we have to look at the strategies that actually are going to target specific groups of students and make sure that while we are strengthening the system as a whole, we're also targeting and implementing strategies that are going to promote more equitable, accelerated achievement. Is another way of framing it. So we're thinking about this year, particularly the data work, the inquiry cycles that really we've had 2 years now to strengthen our data system and the data we have available for us, so that we're really now in some ways uniquely positioned to monitor the impact of our efforts and to make those adjustments that are so necessary. And then part of that work, when we think about those adjustments, is that particular, we call it tier 2. It's in our multi-tiered systems of support. It's that those efforts that specifically target the student groups that right now at least are outside the sphere of success. So with that framing, actually, I'm going to hand it off to the superintendent to provide some data.
There's actually a slight error on the slide.
Oh, cool.
I left it in to see if anyone
Oh,
else was going
yes.
to catch it.
I
So
was,
we'll fix it. But
Okay.
on the left-hand side, it says 1819 SMFCSD, but it really should say San Mateo County. So this is an activity we took all of our leaders through this summer, where we asked our leaders the following question: what is the test score implication of a district or county having fewer socioeconomic students from one year to the next? And I use that term only because that's the term the state uses. But in the state of California, students either qualify for a free and reduced lunch program or don't qualify. And the numbers change slightly from year to year, but essentially, if you earn less than $75,000 a year for a family of 4, which you can imagine that you would never be able to make it in San Mateo County if you earn less than $75,000 without support and assistance. In our district in 2019, we had 2,351 students who took a state test, because again, TK, kinder, first and second grade, the kids don't take state tests, so their number is not included in this. It was actually closer to about 3,900 kids. And in the county of San Mateo, so that includes Pacifica, Cabrillo, Redwood City, South City, and all of the other districts, all the 22 other school districts, that number was 18,154 kids who take state tests and qualified as meeting the requirements for free and reduced lunch. So fast forward to this year, and by this year I mean the year where the kids took the test, which was 23-24. And in the county of San Mateo, that number actually reduced to 15,935. So I took them through this activity where, all of us said it might actually have the impact of increasing your achievement as a county or as a district, because students whose families qualify for the free and reduced lunch program, statistically through the state of California, more often than not, don't meet standards or nearly meet standards, as opposed to meeting or exceeding standards. And I think over the last 4 years we have, and even before that, but certainly, the pandemic kind of introduced some different challenges that really made our focus more about safety and access and computers and things like that. So that year and a half really, threw a challenge at us that really isn't something we could have avoided. Sort of every district kind of went to the same place during that time. But since then, we've implemented a lot of different strategies as a district, and we'll talk about those tonight, all trying to anticipate need and all trying to create equity and access for children who we anticipated had less support during the pandemic and would need continued and improved teaching and learning. And so prior to the pandemic, and I use 18-19 for that reason, because that isn't the year that was affected by the pandemic. And then in 23-24, we had 2,801 students. So you would anticipate that having a really strong impact on lowering our statewide test scores. And you can go to the next slide. That was something we thought a lot about. And what you're looking at here, this is straight off of the state's CASP website. It's a really easy tool to use, and I want to encourage any family that watches this or any educator that watches this to go on the state website for state test scores. And you can click on just a couple of simple clicks, type in our name, and you can pull this information up. Prior to the pandemic, for students who qualified for a free and reduced lunch program, you can see the numbers per grade level. At the time, we had 375 eighth graders who qualified, and this last year we had 449. And then it shows you sort of the breakdown across years. And we grouped together meeting and exceeding standards because, as you know, the margins for meeting and exceeding are often so close that it's a handful of questions. So we really look at both ranges, both score ranges together. And the percentage in 23-24 was 22.5. And prior to that, it was about just over 19. And so we feel really good about the increases that we've seen relative to students meeting and exceeding standards. And of course, there's always much more to do. And as a system, we want to continue to provide more targeted supports for kids who need targeted supports. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. Having gone through the presentation, Kenyatta, with you and Pam and David, I know what's forthcoming. So I'm really eager to give the time back to you all so we can get into more of the analysis with the umbrella of saying we have tried and sought to think about institutional reforms that would lead to system-wide improvement, system-wide access. And we certainly see that with our achievement scores with these young people across the district. And our early education and our early literacy and early math data definitely indicates a strong positive growth in the future, even with kids. As you know, many of our reforms have started at ages 3 to 6. And those students have yet to take any state test scores. So it's really fun to think about watching their growth and their development, but much more to talk about for sure. Maggie, you had a question on the last slide?
No, I'm.
Okay. All right.
So speaking of our youngest kids, when I think about access for all, when we think about changing the conditions, I know I've been here a bunch of times talking about our early literacy work, and part of me can't believe we're already in year 3 of our strategic plan. I won't go necessarily through year 1 and 2 too much, but because we all know we started a reform in the way we teach reading a couple of years ago. And when I think about, when I think about what equity means, when I think about changing the conditions for students, this work in our earliest grades really demonstrates that, and demonstrates the commitment from our board, from our superintendent, for not just saying, hey, let's change reading and see you next year. It was, let's change reading and we're going to spend 5 years on this. And so I think that each year we have really given our teachers and our families and our students the opportunity to learn what this looks like. And so what I'm really excited about for this year, as reflecting on our last couple of years, is this is the first year. So these second graders have now been through our literacy program starting in kindergarten. And actually, I'm just going to do a little side thing that, we talked about, we've been doing reform even with our youngest kids, the students in preschool. On one of the first days of school, I was visiting one of our Title I schools, and I know there's a video or a podcast coming out about it soon, but I was visiting one of our Title I schools lead and just talked to the kinder teachers, how's it going? And the first thing that they talked about was, it is so amazing to have preschool on our campus and having so many kids in preschool because they were able to dive right into the curriculum. I mean, even things like, oh, I know how to line up, or they're all writing their names perfectly. So, you know, that doesn't show necessarily yet in our early literacy data, but our teachers are noticing that. And that's just really exciting because we always want our teachers, they teach a certain grade level, they're responsible for a certain set of standards. And we want to make sure that when they start the year, they're able to dive right in. And so we're starting to see that at kindergarten at one of our Title I schools. And I know it's at many of the others as well. So this year, I think as we head into year 3, continuing our work and going deeper into it, our language and literacy TOSA teams, our teachers working with them are really able to see where and make the curriculum their own. So like where it works, where they need to adjust, where they need to make some changes. I know as a board, we've talked a lot about what about the older students? We want to make sure they're also receiving the interventions they need. So last year we did start looking at tier 2 interventions for 3rd through 5th grade. And we used a couple of different programs. And so this year we're really able to start the year refining those, getting our, soon we'll have our data from our new assessment, identify students that are still struggling and start using those interventions pretty quickly in the school year, during the school day, and also at the after school and our extended learning program. So part of this literacy work in this year is now expanding because we've been able to spend some time really understanding how students learn to read, what curriculum and research practices work for them, and then we can continue that through the grade levels. In a couple of our schools, we've identified that some 3rd graders didn't finish the scope and sequence of the path. So we're doing some of the path as well as an intervention in 3rd grade, as opposed to going to a whole new curriculum. So those are some of the things that, because we have these few years to dive in and really think about it and look at our data, we're able to make some decisions around. Last Friday, our K-2 teachers finished their beginning of the year assessment. And so we were able to get really quickly, thanks to our assessment team, the data in, because the last time we looked at what happened in fall the 1st year, fall the 2nd year, and fall in this 3rd year, 2024. We only have 1st and 2nd, and you might remember that our kinder assessment is a little bit different than our 1st and 2nd grade students take the same assessment. So, you know, I'll give you, I know you guys have had a chance to look at this, but anyone who hasn't yet, you know, if you look at, we're seeing on the top 2 rows, 1st and 2nd grade students not meeting standard over the last couple of years, and those 1st and 2nd meeting. And what you see, which is very exciting in both charts, is we're moving in the right direction. We're having less students in 1st and 2nd grade not meeting standard, and we're having more students in 1st and 2nd grade meeting standard. So that's letting us know that our curriculum is doing what we wanted to do.
And this includes every school.
This includes every school.
And just to add, remember that the fall 2022 PAF assessment was when we first started PAF. So those students were entering 1st and entering 2nd, having not experienced the PAF curriculum. So that's kind of that baseline that you see over the next 2 years.
We did adjust, and we've worked, you know, as we're in our 3rd year, our teachers are using the scope and sequence. We've just, you know, said these books are appropriate for kinder, 1st, 2nd. And so we are seeing maybe we want to, at some point this year, adjust some of the benchmarks, because we know the students are finishing books earlier than we did in our 1st year. So we're looking at that. What we might do is keep kind of the same, and then maybe also have a 2nd set we talked about, just so we can kind of look at both through this school year. And I think I'm back in March to talk about early literacy, so I should have more information on like, what is it like having our initial benchmark data, and what does it look like that we align it a little bit more to our, this is the 1st year with the complete scope and sequence.
And you think it will probably result in having a higher number of words that equates to mastery, or right? Like, we started here, but now we have kids who've had the program for multiple years, so let's just raise. So like a mastery score 2 years ago
might be
the mastery score next year, because we'll anticipate more kids, regardless of school, to right.
I had a quick question on this slide. So if I'm reading this correctly, let's say first grade not meeting and first grade meeting exceeding, shouldn't those two figures add up to 100%, or what was the denominator for these percentages?
But it's, I mean, I think it's possible numbers
Near
too,
is
yeah.
not, we're not including
yeah.
nearly meeting. So there's a band and we were looking at just the lowest performance in the top two bands.
Got it.
Yeah. A lot of times Trustee Kim, I'll ask them to show a graphic that is really easy to see.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when there's, because we're showing like 3 years. So when I saw it with nearly in there, it was just a lot of bars to look at. And I thought, well, what if we just cleaned it up a little bit? But it does mean that it doesn't add up to 100. So maybe we can put a little link to the actual, you know, in terms of after the meeting, add a link so that a person who might want to see all the data together can see it just all in one shot.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
So here again, these are our students in first and second grade not meeting standard by student groups. And so, you know, when we look at this, and we talked about this a lot, David, you know, you'll see in some of the groups, you'll see some, you know, pretty dramatic changes, which is what we're looking for. In some, we see dramatic changes, maybe not exactly in the direction, but then we think about the number of students we might have in those student groups. And so that gives us information around, maybe this is more of a case-by-case study where we need to look at what's happening with those particular students at those particular schools. But again, I think overall we're, you know, I think, you know, for me, this graph really puts a picture to some of the things we talk a lot about in education. We talk about that what works for students who need additional supports, or who are English is not their first language, or who are living in circumstances that not all students are. We believe as educators that those strategies work for all students. And so seeing a graph like this shows that everyone's pretty much moving in the right direction. So those strategies that we want to put in place are not hindering any student group. It's moving students up. And I think that's one of the things that we recognize with this early literacy work, that everyone's going to gain from it instead of only certain student groups.
And just to that point, this is not meeting. So this is, again, the area we want to see the numbers going down.
Right.
So that's why where you see the bars going lower from left to right, or the negative numbers, that's actually what we want. We want that percentage to go down for the not meeting group.
And then the other side of it is median exceeding. And you'll again see, I mean, you know, just from the initial bar graphs, we see our students moving in the right direction.
And to your point, Pam, a moment ago, so for example, a very large increase in our Black African-American population. We should note that in our district, that number of students in first and second is actually rather small. So it's a little more volatile, right, as a number. And then also for our English learners, which is third from the bottom, remember that the past 2 years, we've really invested in the reclassification process. And so we had students in that group heretofore that actually should have reclassified and were higher performing and shouldn't have been in that group. So when we think about where we were in 2022 versus where we are now, that group is, to sort of say, is truly English learners versus mostly English learners with students who should have been reclassified.
The other thing that I think bears discussion is that all of us have either kids in this school district or in another school district. We're too old to remember what school was like. We've idealized that time in our life already. But there are school districts where teachers will be pressured to prep for exams like this. We do not do that. If I have a teacher at any school and they know the interim assessment is going to be on September 12th. We want them teaching all the way up until the day before and prepping for the exam on that day, but we don't want a week of
We don't stop teaching.
test prep. We don't stop teaching to try to, so that's the other thing that's interesting about this, is we're not prepping for this score to go up. this score reflects what is happening.
Mhm.
And that's important to me as the superintendent, to not put a culture in place that just seeks a better test score, especially for an internal assessment, because it will lead to less instructional time. So whereas, you know, we're giving this exam once in basically August, September, again in January, and again in May. Fundamentally, that's 3 times a year. And we're letting our educators teach our students the other times of the year. And we hope that it really reflects growth, and we certainly watch it and reflect on it to think about how our programs are operating. But it isn't something we test prep for. And I think that's very important, because school districts that do that suffer when the test prep changes. And statistically, according to research, students who receive that type of short-term test prep for an upcoming exam, they don't take that improvement with them to the next grade level. So there are different standards, and it doesn't apply from one exam to the next. And I think, you know, our path towards long-term closing of the achievement gap, it really is, it does have something to do with not simply investing time and energy and money into test prep for kids.
Yeah, I think so.
Sorry, 2 quick questions on this slide and the one before. So if I'm looking at, for example, the row for Hispanic students, in terms of not meeting, there was a 20% drop over those 2 years. And then in terms of the second category, there was a 13% rise. So that means those students moved into that middle category that isn't being shown?
Some may have.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
most likely, yeah.
Got it. And then secondly, for the EL students, so if a student or an English language learner, but I guess fluent, are able to read at grade level in their native language, would that be reflected? For example, if it was a student who primarily speaks Spanish and could read in Spanish, but because of the language issue may not be reflected in the English exam, how is that measured with our EL readiness, if at all?
Yeah, I think, let's talk about our multilingual learners, our English learners. One of the most important strategies we can use is to actually reclassify students. And the district, as David mentioned briefly, we struggled coming out of the pandemic because a lot of kids weren't reclassified. So we had a lot of students that first year in 2022 who were classified as multilingual learners or English learners, and they have their scores included in that 2022 bar. But we have gotten really good at building their English language skills and then reclassifying them, which actually pulls them out of the target group. And what we do is we base it on how well they do on their English language exams, but also how well they do on their reading tests and how well they do on their state tests. So that subgroup actually has students who are performing the highest taken out of it every year. Every year, those students no longer become a part of that group. When they have home language or primary language capacity and skills, the exams that we give internally and the state tests don't reflect that. So we will have, you know, in any given situation, you'll have some kids who have a lot of education in their home country, and you'll have others who have very little. And it really is a range.
There you go.
And unfortunately, your hand is right into the sensor. Unfortunately, these exams don't measure that.
Yeah.
We do give a different exam at
Vista Gardens.
Vista Gardens.
Well, and I would add
And,
that
yeah.
we're piloting this year, Trustee Kim, the NWEA map growth reading assessment. This is for grades 3 through 8. We have the English assessment, and then we're piloting the Spanish reading assessment as well. So teachers are identifying students that they think, again, at this point, it's only our Spanish speaking or Spanish reading students, but we're assessing that they seem to have some skill in Spanish reading. They are taking that assessment as well. That actually is beginning next week. So we're going to start to have some data for that particular multilingual group. We have not yet found across the board assessments. I mean, Mandarin, of course, is assessed at College Park, but we don't assess Mandarin reading, for example, for students at Audubon, kind of things.
Yeah, and I think, and one of the things like in the early literacy work, especially around the science reading and the structured literacy, which we follow, is that when students have a strong literacy background in their home language, they transfer it really quickly, because you learn to read usually in the first language, and then you can transfer it into the second language. And that's sort of like, you know, for Fiesta Garden, they have students who are, you know, come from Spanish-speaking homes, and they have students that come from English-speaking homes, but they learn to read in Spanish there, regardless of the background. So like you know, so I think, yes, we don't in the K2 have something that might assess them in their primary language, but we know that when students come in with that, they transfer it pretty quickly and it shows up in these assessments. And if they don't, we work with them.
That's great. Yeah, I was just thinking, for a student who is able to read in their home language, the type of intervention would look different than a student who couldn't. And so the fact that we are going to be having that data, especially for our Spanish-speaking students, is great to hear. Thank you all.
Yeah.
So before we turn to a more specific focus on middle school, we wanted to just take a couple of minutes actually circling back with you on you know, another important factor that's impacting our student achievement. You've heard me say in other meetings, we've talked about the impact of chronic absenteeism. And because of the work that's being done with our community schools, wanted to, in this kind of elementary moment, to emphasize that work. So you see in front of you here, this is probably not surprising to anybody, but this is our spring CAST data. And you can see it's sorted between students who are chronically absent versus those who are not. And, you know, not surprisingly, the percentage of students for students who are chronically absent, the performance skews low, right? We have 54% of our students who are chronically absent also score at a level 1 not met. And then you see, of course, if you're not chronically absent, it skews higher, right? It means that you are in school more, you're accelerating your learning, and you have higher levels of performance. So we wanted to just provide this as a frame to then tee up the what this looks like school by school, and the importance here. We're talking a lot tonight about, you know, might be considered like the academic strategies we are implementing, but there are other strategies which are going to have important academic impacts. And one of those is the set of community school strategies, which of course I'm kind of assuming, you know, we are all familiar with the grant that we secured and the implementation at 5 sites of these strategies of really reaching out, providing more services to students and families, providing greater opportunities to engage with families, to bring them into schools, and to support their needs. And what you'll see here is that if you sort schools by the percentage of chronic absenteeism, and you can see there kind of the rank order of it. And I want you to note that 4 of our 5 elementary schools that have the highest levels of chronic absenteeism are now engaged in the community schools work. So while it's important that we continue to do the academic work, particularly that we've just been discussing, we should take that broader view of that there's a other set of strategies which is going to ensure that students are in school more and benefiting from those instructional academic focused strategies. So let me just pause there if you have any questions about that. We just wanted to kind of underscore that other impact of chronic absenteeism.
And that means the student missed 18 days of school.
Mm-hmm.
So at Laurel,
This is from last year.
Yes.
1 out of every 3 students missed 18 days of school or more. So that presents a really, really big opportunity for us to connect with families, support families, build that knowledge base, build that support system. And we have some pretty, it won't be part of this meeting, but we have some pretty exciting strategies we have in place that are kicking off right now as we speak, that we think are going to make a big dent in that issue.
All right, we'll push on then. We'll turn to, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one point. My apologies, Kenyatta. And that as we're thinking about the community schools work, of course, there are other schools where chronic absenteeism is, a significant challenge. And so, I just wanted, again, you've heard about these strategies, but I wanted to tie them to this particular problem of chronic absenteeism that, if students aren't in school enough, of course, the learning they can do at home through our literacy Footsteps to Brilliance program and our ST Math program is very important. And then when they are in school, that we get more time with them after school to work on academic and other enrichment opportunities. So, we've seen a near doubling of our annex and partner programs in terms of the number of classrooms after school in the last couple of years. And this year in particular, every school is implementing an additional academic intervention program that's being funded with the ELOP funds. So, again, these strategies, to ensure that students who struggle with chronic absenteeism continue to have academic supports. Maggie,
I had a question about the camps that we've been running, like in the summer and spring break and fall break, that sort of thing. And I don't think we've done this doesn't include the sort of targeted or we don't know exactly, it's not specific to those kids, but I'd be curious, as we discuss achievement data, if we can sort of assess how much those camps help kids and the kids that attend those camps. I'd love to see that.
Okay. I mean, I think we'll get to, we'll continue to talk about our students who come from families with economic need, and it's very true that those camps are targeting those groups of students. So I think some of the data that we have that shows the positive impact for those students, it reflects that. But I think we can do a tighter, what are we seeing that growth look like?
It's our next study session.
Yeah, I heard.
I was meeting with the two administrators who will be presenting on that very issue.
All right, now, Kenyatta.
All right, thank you, David.
Yeah.
So in thinking about how we started this presentation, really focused in on our equity lens and thinking about what are we doing around access and what are we doing to better support our students. This is presented in a year 1, 2, 3 sort of format, but I'm going to talk about it more holistically. So within 3 years, we've done some major moves to make sure all of our students have access to the core curriculum. And so when I say major moves, it's pretty unheard of in most districts to have consecutive years of adoptions of new curriculum. When you think about our science curriculum is presented there first, Open Sci-Ed, TCI is our social studies curriculum, My Perspectives is our ELA curriculum that was board adopted at the end of last school year, and then ILIT is our ELD curriculum. We did all of that in under 4 years. So I am calling that out because we really truly are looking at our conditions and seeing where do we really need to lean in and do the work, and where do we have spots where we need to improve things. And our curriculum adoption was definitely one of those areas that have been many, many years since we had new social studies, ELA, and science curriculum, and now ELD curriculum in the hands of our students and our teachers. And so when I mentioned talking about this holistically, having access to core curriculum is one piece of the puzzle, making sure teachers know how to implement that curriculum and have professional development is another side of that coin. So we've taken a different approach, very different than you see in a lot of districts, which is really thinking about PD, not just at 3 different moments during the year, but how are we using our staff meetings? How are we using our professional development time that we have? But beyond that, how are we using our time that we have after school during common planning time, instructional planning time, to support our teachers with the new curriculum? So we have a strategy that really leans into lead teachers. Specifically, we have ELA and MAP lead teachers who have release time during their day to support teachers with curriculum implementation and coaching and co-teaching, and also curriculum development. When you get new curriculum, many teachers will tell you the pacing guides come from the publishers. It actually takes 1 year of teaching with new curriculum to figure out what are all the key components and pieces. And then in year 2, your team of lead teachers, your team of teacher leaders at your sites need to now look at the scope and sequence after teaching for 1 year and make it work for a block schedule model. Figure out what worked, what didn't, what tasks and activities do we want to implement, which ones do we want to rearrange, do we like the way the units are laid out, do we want to change them? So I'm saying all those details just to give you a sense of it's pretty complex when you implement new curriculum. It's not simply, here you go, now you have this tool that's going to automatically translate into high student achievement. It's much more layered than that, and you have the PD component underneath it. And part of the PD component is also making sure that teachers have time to collaborate. And so when they're really massaging the new curriculum to make sure that it works within the 85-minute block period, make sure that they're looking at the student data based on the standards, they have to make changes from 1 year to the next. And so the model that we have in place this year that's new, so you're thinking about year 3, is really bringing our principals into this equation, because it's one piece to have teacher leaders working and collaborating, but to really build up our site principals and support them to be instructional leaders is another key component that kind of like wraps it all together. So this year, the focus is really about helping our site principals at our 4 comprehensive middle schools and also at our Montessori's to become instructional leaders on their campuses. And that starts with having a site instructional leadership team. When your site leaders, and we've done this very well in our district the last 3 years, getting them used to looking at equity data, getting them used to looking at, you saw the chronic absenteeism, achievement data, but start to diagnose what's happening here on our campus and what are some professional learning practices and strategies that we need to focus on as a site, and empowering teacher leaders along with the principals to be in partnership with each other to make those decisions. And that may look different at Bowditch, and it may look different at Abbott or Burrell or Bayside, but what's the same is that all those site leaders are focused in on their achievement data, and they're having conversations with teacher leaders to say, this is the focus we think we need to have. I'm going to give you an example. Academic discourse. When we go into our classrooms, we're not really hearing kids making meaning or talking about the content in a critical way that'll elevate their critical thinking. So what kind of strategy do we think as a school we need to focus in on and do some data gathering around? So getting principals to be at that instructional leadership level is the focus for this year. And that's a shift. That's a shift. And what we're seeing is, as principals are in classrooms more and teacher leaders are in each other's classrooms, then it becomes a community of practice where I'm down the hallway and I'm pushing another teacher in the classroom and asking questions and saying, hey, you know what, I did this lesson. I actually had a lot of great academic discourse going on. I'm gonna share that with you. You can come in and watch me, or I can come in and model it. And then we start to share those best practices. So this slide has really the whole scope for the last 3 years in terms of how powerful curriculum development can be, and how powerful it is when you know not only just focus on the curriculum side of the house, but you bring in the professional development at the teacher leader level, at the principal level. And then you start to empower those site teams to really focus on instructional practices that'll make a difference. And that's a shift for us because we haven't worked like that in this district. But we know that it's that intentional kind of work like that that's going to really start to move the needle for individual sites. So, questions?
So let's talk about that impact. Kind of picking up on where Superintendent Ochoa started us with looking at this question of students with identified coming from families with economic need. Last year, we took a slice of the middle school data just to have a focus, which was 7th graders. So coming back the same with the same focus on 7th graders. And actually, maybe tell me what you see as you looked at the met and exceeded combined, exceeded, met, and nearly across 2019, 2023, and 2024.
I mean, there's a drop, right? And then 2023. I think it's a little bit hard to tell, like, if it was like an immediate drop during the pandemic and then like a recovery. But it's interesting, but now we're for the met and exceeded, we're at almost pre-pandemic levels, which is great. And I had noticed earlier with our socioeconomically disadvantaged kids that we actually have 500 more students with need than we did before. And it's and then even overall in the county enrollment has dropped, so that was really or at least like the number of overall kids with need had dropped significantly. So I was interested to see that like our district has compared to like the county overall has really increased, and is we're still able to have these positive results, which is great.
The other thing we see is mobility. As you know, housing is a tremendous challenge for our families.
Yeah.
So the number of students who attend school A for 1st and 2nd and 3rd grade and then transfer to school B because they literally moved from like the North Shoreview neighborhood over to the Hillsdale Mall neighborhood, and parents, they can't traverse that and get all their kids to school. That's increased since the pandemic. So intra-district mobility and inter. So you might look at a group of kids in 3rd grade in 2019 and think like, oh, that's the group of kids that's here in 7th grade in 2024, and it's not.
Yeah.
Because so many of our students enter and leave, and oftentimes, the two of you were principals in this district, they're both nodding your heads the whole time because that's the story we hear during that registration process of, I'm now at Park, I used to be at North Shoreview, and I just can't make it over there anymore. We moved to a different part of town. And the uniqueness of that family structure. We have a new baby, or I got a new job and I'm in Redwood City now. I used to be able to take them. So it really does add to that, just the complexity of economic need. It is such an advantage to have a home, to have parents or assistants, either with grandparents or perhaps somebody who assists the family to get kids to and from school. That we see the economic need category really just being this very rich combination of factors So when a kid does attend Meadow Heights for a couple of years and then goes to Park School down the road, our systems still work. Our instruction still works. Our programs work. The Chromebook works. The after-school programs go from one school to the next. So that's a really wonderful addendum to this, to this issue of our families with economic aid.
And I would add, kind of connecting to Kenyetta's overview a few minutes ago, that when we think about our open science ed curriculum, which is really cutting edge at the level of academic discourse and active student engagement in that learning impacts their English performance. Similarly with TCI, and we're expecting even more so as we continue the implementation for English language arts, the My Perspectives and the Highlight for ELD. And so we've already, with the strategies, you can see we've gotten this rebound from 23 into 24 to the point, we're almost back to pre-pandemic, and we think about the learning loss that happened in that time. I mean, obviously we want to shoot beyond that, that's our goal, but for this group, this is, I think, some pretty dramatic. I'm very excited about this kind of data. So, and then, when we go on, we were talking a minute, I've shared with you in other moments over the last year, particularly, some ways our ELA data has been a little flat, right? And we do have to factor in, if the data's rather flat, but we've seen a rather significant shift in the demographics of our district, where we might expect decline because we have a higher percentage of students who, at least statistically, as the superintendent pointed out, have been lower performing. There's something positive, at least in kind of holding ground in performance as we try to catch these students up. So, but nonetheless, we look at this and we say, okay, well, our English learners, the very slight improvement, but are we satisfied with that? No, we need to implement the ELD curriculum, and we need to support our teachers in that implementation. Here's looking at just kind of two key ethnic groups, and you'll see, a nice rebound for with our African American students, but kind of again that holding serve, rather flat growth with our Hispanic Latinx students. And then finally, if we look at our students with disabilities in 7th grade, again, it is rather flat growth. So it's important to look at it and make the point about the shifting demographics, but it's also important to recognize it's still flat, and we need to have that acceleration. Let me pause there for a minute, because I did go through those other two slides rather quickly, if any of the trustees have questions about those.
One slide back, I think, wait, 2 slides back. Yeah, I guess I'm not totally sure I understand this one. Because the met and exceeded, oh, I see, okay, never mind. Okay, I'm good.
Yeah. So basically, we had more exceeded students in 23, 24, so it's equivalent to the met.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit confusing. There's like, the data missing? All right, then to push on, I'm going to connect to some of the points that Kenyetta made in a moment and talk about middle school math. And again, this was an area of terrific change in our district, starting actually 4 years ago with a very significant board vote to implement the, we are here, there we go, implement new pathways in the middle school.
Need some movement.
Goes to try to fix it.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. Keep going.
And so year one, just a couple years ago was our first implementation of the heterogeneous Math 6 for all. And this was, eliminating a separate pathway in sixth grade. And then a lot of work around implementing kind of a curriculum that emphasized academic discourse, that emphasized the importance of students arriving at the correct answer in a variety of ways, so-called multiple representations. There's always the smart math student in class who can get to an answer quickly because they know the algorithmic approach to it. But then inviting other students who have different kinds of math experiences to describe different ways of getting to the same answer. So, and we've talked about low floor, high ceiling tasks with you all at previous meetings. So all of this work has been to strengthen, the quality of curriculum across the board, but also to be implementing curriculum and strategies, instructional strategies that particularly accelerate the performance of our struggling students. In some ways, we could say the middle school math work is maybe a year or two ahead of the ELA work, where we're thinking about the level of teacher collaboration, the level of kind of coordination across the scope and sequence of the curriculum. So we're using them very much as sort of, this is what happens when we approach the work in this way that Kenyatta was describing before. So to say that, and then to come back to, well, what do we think are the impacts of this? I'm going to put this up and invite you to take a minute and look at, so this is 8th grade algebra enrollment. So you may recall 4 years ago when the board made its decision to shift math pathways, the commitment from the district was that this would actually significantly increase algebra enrollment in 8th grade. And you can see that if 2021-22 is our baseline, and there were approximately 174 students in algebra that year, and the next year it went to 228, the next year it went to 304, and now this year it's 388. So you're seeing basically over the last 2 years, about a 10% increase, percentage point increase each year in the number of 8th graders enrolled in algebra. So now if you kind of generally we think in 8th grade, there's approximately 1,000 students. So basically 40% of our 8th graders are enrolled in algebra. And then we also want to look at, well, how does this break down with particular ethnic groups? We started off very early looking at the fact that in our first year, only 4% of our Hispanic Latinx students were enrolled in algebra. And now we are at 15%. So in 3 years, a quadrupling. Now the numbers are still low. It's still disproportionate. It should be closer to 30, 32% if it was proportionate to our enrollment of Hispanic Latinx students, but it's a tremendous increase. And I've added, just in case there's sort of questions, for example, I've added in the last couple of years for several of the groups, I've added the N, because with the shifting percentages and the greater number of students overall enrolled, it kind of looks like, for example, for our Asian students, did we experience a dramatic drop? Well, no, we actually have more Asian students enrolled in algebra, but it's just because the overall number has gone up so dramatically, the percentage has shifted. All right, and then coming back to CASP performance. So this is, similar to what we were looking at for ELA. We were focusing on students coming from families with economic need. And here you can see if the gold bar is that pre-pandemic baseline, that for our 7th grade students, we are now, 5 percentage points beyond the performance in 2019 of students who are performing met or exceeded on the CASP math assessment. So where I mentioned earlier, we want to see that acceleration beyond pre-pandemic in mathematics in 7th grade, we're seeing that. And then if we want to look at our English learners, we had a nice improvement last year, basically have kept pace with that, although it's notable that the number who exceeded or the percentage who have exceeded has dropped, but the percentage who have met has gone up. So a very slight increase there for our English learners from last year to this. And then looking again at 2 key ethnic groups, you can see these populations in some ways are far exceeding pre-pandemic performance. And then finally, with our students with disabilities, this is a place where we've seen a slight drop. So obviously wanting to dig into that and understand what that is, you know, why we would see, and we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in the percentage who've exceeded. However, we saw a pretty dramatic decrease in the percentage who've met. So that's an area for future discussion. And that's actually the last of our slides. I'll pause for a minute if you want to go back and talk about any of these specific data slides with respect to math.
I'd be curious to, I mean, I don't know if you have the data on this at your fingertips, but I'd be curious what the N is for this, especially the students with disabilities. And just anecdotally, I'm aware of some students, particularly the, you know, better resourced families choosing, you know, to go to other schools that might, you know, that they feel are more specifically geared towards like their students' particular learning challenge. So I'm curious, like, you know, similar to the data around English learners being reclassified, like I'm wondering if there is like, if there's like a demographic explanation for that. I'd be curious.
Yeah, I mean, we should dig into that, and let me actually take the opportunity when we come back in a couple of weeks, at least around the CAST data. I'll try to get you more specific. We had an opportunity to sort of preview this presentation with Cabinet yesterday and spoke with some of our special education leaders. And, you know, of course, the goal of special education too is to move students out of special education. And right now, from the year before to last year, we had approximately 100 students out of approximately 1,300 move out of special education. That's a kind of roughly equivalent to what a reclassification process is, right? We're hoping that we're, you know, it's much more complex than that, but I'll come back with some of those kind of the denominator. For you.
Yeah, I just really curious to see that.
Yeah.
I had a question as well, but I would reiterate the point that Trustee Trin made. I think for some of these data sets, it's tough to understand when we know we have high churn, whether it's reclassification or students moving to other schools. It's a little bit tougher to take the year-over-year data and understand the pattern we're seeing if we don't know how many of the students were, say, represented each of those groups. But I was going to ask separately about the algebra enrollment. This is a point that I've raised before because I've heard critiques of the way we talk about our algebra progress. And so one of the comments that I received from other parents who were still kind of confused about the math changes that we've made is that enrollment in itself is a strange metric because, to be honest, we could achieve 100% if algebra was mandatory. The question I keep receiving is, do we have data on the back end about whether every student, you know, hit the achievement levels that we would expect and is actually gaining the full benefit of the increases in enrollment? I'm just wondering, do we have the data points to make that case, or will those be available at some point in the future?
Yeah, we certainly can. I was in discussion with with Amy Burke, our math coordinator, and for example, the data we had last year of those, let me get the number, the 304 students who were enrolled if you look at grades as one indicator, for example, I think she said maybe 6 to 7 students didn't achieve a C+ or higher. So that's one indicator we could look at. Also, we could share a little bit. There's some interesting data about how access to algebra has accelerated student performance on CASP. So looking at how did the students score when they were in 7th grade on CASP, and how did they score after being in algebra in 8th grade? And again, remember, this is students who are in the single period of algebra who have chosen, call it an acceleration path, and then the students in 8th grade who take both Math 8 and algebra. That's combined. So we could come back. I'll pull that data at least, by way of example for you for the next meeting.
That would be great. Thank you.
David, can I ask a question on the algebra since Trustee Kim just brought this up? Do we ever look or connect with the high school district to find out are algebra students ready for algebra 2 when it's time? Like, how are they doing? Did they go right into algebra 2? Because I do think they have to take some sort of test to determine whether they're ready.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have specific information of that. I do know, Hillsdale stands out as an example because even if students are taking algebra as 8th graders, everybody goes into geometry as a 9th grader, if I'm not mistaken.
That's true.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. But
I think we could still look to see, are they ready in sophomore year? Are they going into algebra 2 or are they taking algebra 1 again? Or what are maybe we could see that at some point.
So kind of more of that longitudinal enrollment.
Yeah, because I think we can't really, in my mind, of course, we can use our own metrics and see if they are meeting the standards for our district. But I guess the question is, are they ready for high school algebra 2?
Mm-hmm.
So David, you may recall that recently we were looking at enrollment in the next math. So to your question, President Proctor, the high school, we just reached out to them recently to ensure that our students who took Algebra 1 here with us and received a passing grade, that they are enrolled in the next course. So at Hillsdale, as we just mentioned, that's geometry, but at our other schools, it would be going into Algebra 2. And so they are taking our grades and saying that is sufficient to put a student in Algebra 2. Now, to your question though is like, how are they doing once they're in algebra 2? And we can look into that and get more information about that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to go to public comment and see if there's any comments, and we can come back and have a discussion? I can't see the screen anymore, so.
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, is there anyone in the audience there?
I'm gonna come out.
No one in the audience.
Okay, how about Zoom? Can we check Zoom?
Checking Zoom. No public comments at this time.
Okay, great. Then I think we can kind of do a final conversation here. Any trustees have any comments?
Just one comment from my end. I really want to reiterate the point that President Proctor made. And I think on our prior conversations, I believe it was Montessori schools, that there have been some concern from parents about lacking pathways. And I know groups of parents have individually looked into summer courses to make sure that their students are ready to jump into high school level math once they get there. And I'm just very curious to see how that transition is going. So to the extent that we're having this conversation anyhow, that is something that I would emphasize as well, because we know for NSM parents, Parkside, others, this has been a concern that they've expressed to us as well, in terms of making sure that as they leave our system, they're going into the high school system fully equipped to succeed there and at the same level as their peers that may be coming in from other districts.
I agree with that. I just had a general comment or question, and it's about, I guess in general, how are we making sure that as we focus on equity and the achievement gap, that we are keeping, that students who need more challenge are getting challenged, but we're not creating a wider gap. There's always this criticism about, equity means that we're teaching to the lowest,
achievement level, but I know that's not true in our district. And so I was just wondering if you could kind of expand on some of the strategies that our district uses to make sure that everybody's getting what they need, but we're not contributing more towards a bigger gap.
Well, I mean, I think in the elementary schools, kind of what I mentioned earlier is we are developing strategies that teachers use to engage students that we know are necessary for students with need, but work for all. So for example, one of the big strategies that we use, this is outside of the K2, because, you know, I do more than just the K2, but we call it collaborative conversations. And so where teachers, after they're using their curriculum, they want to make sure students have an understanding of it. So they set up what they call collaborative conversations, where they'll have a partner A, a partner B, and they're both engaging in the talk. And it doesn't matter if David's a student that has needs and I'm not, we're both engaging in those conversations. So in elementary, at least, we look for strategies. And I think that's what we started seeing in our early literacy data, that work for all students, but are necessary for some. So that's just an example I could think of in elementary.
Right, and then a lot of our curriculum, whether it's digital or if it's a hard copy, it has actual scaffolding and differentiation tools for teachers embedded in it. So what that allows a teacher to do is still teach grade level standards, but for those students that need different kinds of modifications, they can engage those components. Let me give you an example. I was talking with one of the my perspectives reps today about the training. We're planning for the training on Monday, and one of our SDC teachers came to our previous training, and she really wanted to know how to differentiate the text for her students. Well, in my perspective, there's an audio function. So that means for all the anchor text, the grade level text, all the bridging text, you can engage an audio function that reads it for students. So if I'm in an SDC class, I'm not using a different textbook than my grade level peer. Actually, we can use the same, even if I'm performing 1 or 2 grade levels below, I can use the same grade level text and read it and listen to the audio version of it. So there's different differentiation tools embedded in our curriculum that allows the teachers to still teach at grade level and then allow for that differentiation and access for other students.
Yeah, you just reminded me to say, you know, one of our big things that David mentioned earlier is access to the core. Access to the core doesn't mean I'm going to bring the level of the work down to anybody who doesn't. Access means what are the strategies that we're using in the classroom, and sometimes it means giving students an ability to listen to it read aloud because maybe they're not necessarily able to read it just yet. Sometimes that means access by, I'm going to put kids in collaborative groups so they can, what we call in math, like the low floor, high ceiling work. So the task can take students from wherever they can enter and go to as high as a student can think about it. It also, ways we do that when we think about the curriculum, and even in PATH provides, it is a, you know, it's a curriculum that, you know, that we're doing a lot of times in whole group, but teachers that need to, sometimes they move students. And so some students that need a faster pace, they go to faster pace. Some students that need a slower pace, they do it at a slower pace. So we don't need to necessarily adjust or change the curriculum. It's what strategies are we using so everyone has access to that curriculum.
And I would add, we could go back, I won't pull some of the slides up, but, you know, like that algebra enrollment data, you know, for, you know, historically higher performing groups, it hasn't changed. In some ways, it's gotten better. So I'd want, and if we look at some of the other data, you'll see similar patterns. So, I mean, I think it's an interesting challenge when a district commits to an equity focus, that there's a worry that it means we're not focused on certain groups of students. And the strategies that are being described here, when you step into classrooms and you see the, you know, innovative ways in math that teachers are engaging students in academic discourse and this multiple representations, it really is powerful evidence that all these children are being challenged, even while we're saying, because we know particularly this strategy is going to accelerate the performance of these historically lower performing students. So, so I'd really want us to think about how can we stay comfortable as a district with naming and being explicit and calling out, and at the same time saying to folks, and be comfortable with that, because your child, if you're not in that group, are still receiving high quality instruction.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, and I think one last thing in the literacy work, when I think about the equity, the decisions we made that are equity focused, is if there's a school in need, every school has a language and literacy TOSA that's helping support high quality coaching and interventions and tier 1 support. But our students and our schools, like our Title I schools, they have 2. And I think, like, when I always think about, like, that's an equity decision that we make. It's not something like, it's not a different program. It's not necessarily a different curriculum, but we're going to give more support because there's more support needed.
Thank you for that response. I just wanted to kind of, congratulate the teachers and students and everyone in our district for, setting this like sight on equity years ago. And like, we're seeing the results in the data. When we visit classrooms, we see students fully engaged and teachers really engaged with their students. And so it's really nice to see how the strategies are working. And obviously there's more work to do, but just wanted to congratulate everyone on just the progress that's been made, especially since the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other comments? If there's nothing else, we could wrap it up. If anyone would like to make a motion to adjourn, we can do that, or we can continue.
Only 3 people can.
Second.
Thank you, Trustee Kim, for the motion and Trustee Trin for the second. All in favor, say aye. Oh, I guess let me do a roll call since we're like all remote. So we'll go with Trustee Trin.
Yes.
Trustee Kim.
I guess yes.
Okay, and I vote yes too. We'll be adjourned at 6:50 p.m. Thank you so much for tonight.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
So I think tonight is, Joe, if you can take